I'm Pamela Reeves, and welcome to Hidden Figures, the secret legacy of women in tech. So if you're in the wrong panel and you think you're somewhere else, stay anyway, because this is going to be fascinating. So I'm here with two remarkable women who are also incredibly high energy. So you're going to enjoy this. Put on your seatbelts. Peggy Johnson, to my far left, is the Executive Vice President for Business Development at Microsoft. And Margot Shetterly, to my close left, is the author of the best-selling book that became the Academy Award-winning movie, Hidden Figures. As Kristen noted, I work every day for years on issues of gender parity and inclusion, from women's economic empowerment and their economic lives to political participation and leadership and agency and voice for women. And I can tell you that there is one thing that I know for sure about where we are now. And that thing is that women are not new. And women's capacity to excel in all sectors is not new. What's new is the increased opportunity for women to realize their full potential in every sector, and the fact that their stories are being told, finally, and that women's stories are being woven into the American narrative. And that has changed everything. And that's sort of what we're going to talk about today. We're going to sort of explore the myriad issues about women and tech and leadership, and explore the barriers that women have overcome, that they've broken themselves, both in the creation of science and technology and in the science and technology industry. And I want to frame this conversation by just sharing a few numbers with you. So starting in 1959, which is sort of part of the era that you write about in your book, maybe the end of that era, you'll tell us more. Women, the engineering and scientific workforce included 8% women. So that's not a really good number. We have improved. We have not improved enough. Today it's about 24%. But when you go into the detail, it's 3% African American women, 5% Asian women, and 1% Hispanic women. So that doesn't really reflect that well on the fabric of our nation. But I will tell you that what's additionally disturbing is that we're missing out on a lot of economic growth and productivity. So we know, we've done a lot of research, we've done a lot of delving, and we know the benefits of investing in women. For instance, female entrepreneurs have generated, on average, a 35% higher return on investment than their male counterparts. That's a fact. We know, let me just get my cheat sheet here, that if we could improve ethnic and gender diversity in the US technology workforce overall, we could add about $570 billion in new value to the industry, which would add over 1.5% to our GDP. That's a lot of additional productivity, and that is a lot of additional dollars. So those are a bunch of numbers, but they tell a story. And that's the story we're going to talk about today. It's a story of access and inclusion. It's a story of bias and opportunity. And it's a story about how, when we unleash the full potential of every human being, regardless of their race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, or gender, what kind of power and what kind of growth we can get. So with that, I really want to start with asking you two about your own stories. Margot, if I can start with you. You're an extraordinary writer. Thank you. You revealed to all of us a story that very few of us know. And in a way, it's a personal story, though you yourself are not a NASA scientist that I know of. And I wonder if you could tell us, first, if you could frame a little bit briefly, what is the story of Hidden Figures, how you found the story, why did you feel the need to tell it, and sort of how that came about. And if you could sneak in a line about your background as an investment banker and how you think that's related, that would be fascinating.
Okay, so a lot in that first question. So Hidden Figures is a story. It's a story that we all know, that Tom Wolfe wrote about in The Right Stuff, that James Michener wrote about in his book Space. It starts in World War II, and it really covers the American quest to for better, faster airplanes through the Cold War into the space race and the conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. So my story follows that path. It just happens to show the story through the eyes, the lives, the work of a group of African-American female mathematicians who worked at what would become NASA. It was originally called the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, and it became NASA in 1958. I grew up in Hampton, Virginia. My father worked at NASA. He's now retired, but he was an atmospheric research scientist. And I had the extreme good fortune of working or living in the same community with Katherine Johnson, with Mary Jackson, and with a plethora of other women, black, white, other backgrounds, who also worked at NASA as mathematicians, math aides, engineers, scientists. I mean, there were any number of names for the work they did depending on the particular position, but really talented women in technology who essentially fueled our country's ascent in aeronautics and to space, and really laid the groundwork for modern computation in many ways. So my background, I sort of came at this, writing this book, in a very counterintuitive way, I guess. My career path really started out as an investment banker. I worked at Merrill Lynch and JP Morgan. I sort of plowed my way through the early days of what was then called .com, which now sounds like a very dated term, so I guess I'm dating myself a little bit, but the early days of internet media. And then my husband, Aaron, who's here, who also has the honor of being the first person, listening to my dad telling this story of these women, the first person to ask, why haven't I heard this story before? So he's a part of this story. So we met in New York, we moved to Mexico, we started a magazine, so there are all these different things in different parts of my life that came together in order for me to eventually write this book, Hidden Figures. So I'm not sure if that answered your original question or not.
Well, I was trying to figure out how I was going to go from, doing the kinds of things that you do or not to becoming a best-selling author on my first book.
It was a lot of serendipity and amazing people, and I think most of all, a great story that I was lucky to find.
Great story. Peggy, so you are remarkable, right? You've defied so many odds. About 18% of undergraduate engineering degrees are held by women today, and yet you're an engineer, and you worked for GE as an engineer very successfully. About 20% of senior executives in the tech industry are women, including at your own company, and yet you're a very important senior executive at Microsoft, and you were at Qualcomm for many years as well. So you are a statistic that has defied statistics. And I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about how that happened. I mean, it shouldn't have, right? But here you are today. And is your story something that other people can aspire to or follow the same path?
I think so, and I think it is nice to tell a story versus just looking at the stats, because the stats are a little disappointing. But the story is, I was one of 15 kids, Irish Catholic, and I had tons of brothers and sisters above me. And when I went off to college, I remember my advisor in high school saying, well, what do you want to major in? And I said, I don't know. And you have no idea? And I said, well, I like math and science. And she said, business major, and put me down as a business major. And I said, okay. And off I went to college. Like, that's how I made my big decisions in life. And I head down to college, and I had to have a job because I had a bunch of brothers and sisters. My parents had two rules. You must go to college and you must pay for it yourself. So I had a job. And I was delivering mail to the engineering department, and the two ladies behind the desk started asking me questions about, did I like math and science? And I said, yeah, I love it. And they said, have you ever thought about being an engineer? And I said, I don't really know what an engineer is, because people had never really told me what an engineer did. So here I am, just an open book to these ladies, and they went to work on me, and the next day I changed my major to engineering. So there wasn't a lot of thought process, but this sort of accidental. So then I got into the field, and it was 30 years of being in the tech industry, which has changed a lot, and the numbers have definitely improved. We're not where we want to be, certainly, but things are more optimistic than they were when I first graduated.
So I'm curious about that, actually. Do you see progress? Do you see progress internally for women? Or are there different perspectives, programs? I mean, what's happening?
Well, one thing, we're shining a light on it. We're all talking about our numbers, and we're sharing them publicly. Our numbers have improved, albeit slowly, but they're improving. Our numbers of women in management, which we're also tracking, are also improving. But this is hard. You really have to get to the core of what's going on, and it starts all the way back in school. We need people to encourage more young women to pursue degrees in science and technology. Once they get there, there needs to be an environment that's inclusive for them. I several times, in my early days of engineering, thought about quitting. I just thought, I cannot work in this environment. It was very, very aggressive. I was always the only woman in the room. I didn't have a lot of allies. I didn't feel the allies. And one day I came to the conclusion, I'm going to leave. And my manager said, no, wait, let's dig into that a little bit. Let me try and understand, why are you leaving? And I said, I don't know, my performance reviews, you're always marking me down for not speaking up enough. It's hard for me to do. I'm the only woman in the room. I don't look like everybody else. And he said, we're going to dig in here more. And he went and changed our performance review structure and added attributes in there that a lot of women or quiet men have, of being, team players, being collaborative. And those things became valued as much as being assertive and being an independent thinker. And that changed the game for me, completely changed the game. My career took a shot upwards after that. I could just be myself. And it was all pretty much good after that.
So it's interesting that you say you could just be yourself. Margot and I had a brief conversation the other day about the segregation by NASA of these, or NACA, whatever it's called.
Yeah, the NACA, which was
NACA.
the predecessor, and then NASA.
Of these women, but kind of what the effect of that isolation was, and what kind of strength and how it might be liberating. And I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit, and also, does the story of Hidden Figures, as we know now through your book and through the movie, is that a business success story for NASA?
Those are really good questions. I mean, so the story takes place from the 1940s through the 1969 with the moon landing. And those, as we all know, many of those years were years of legalized racial segregation in the South, and not just in the South, but particularly in the South of the United States. Because of that, even though these women were hired, even though this was a federal installation, the installation had to apply by the state rules, which was racial segregation, segregated bathrooms, segregated cafeterias, and a segregated workroom. So the black women worked in an area called the West Area. They were called West Area Computing, even though everyone knew they were the colored computers. The white women were in East Area. And so, obviously that racial segregation and having to, come to work to do the job of calculating the trajectory for astronauts and then still having to use the colored bathroom. I mean, that is, we don't even have to go into the details of what that does to you to have to maintain that kind of dual consciousness. But at the same time, there was a group of women, so that not just the black women, but even the white women who were in these other groups. They were all together, They didn't have to say, I don't know another black female mathematician, because they were in a room with 25 of them. They were in a larger group with, hundreds of women whose professional job was to do math all day. So even as we, as time went on and they progressed and they got rid of the segregated racial segregation, they put the women into the different work groups, so they weren't just women-only groups. These women had that heritage, I guess, if you will, of having, been not the only one. And it's really interesting now, a lot of times when I go to colleges, I see young women who echo, exactly, Peggy, what you're saying, your experience of having been the only engineer, of having had no support, of having felt, outsider. And so there was a real, even as they all fought to break down those walls of segregation, it did give them a sense that they weren't the only ones there. And so, I don't know that you could call anything that, at least from our modern perspective, that involves racial segregation or gender segregation, gender pay disparity, because the women were paid less, even if they were doing the same work. I mean, those are not exactly progressive values by our standards today. At the same time, that gave those women a foot in the door. It changed the future for their families and for the people who came in, the next generation, like my father and our family. It opened the door to how people perceive female engineers, what women could do, that women were not just not bad at math, but some women were incredibly good at math. So I personally feel that, when you look at it from day, it's not exactly a progressive story, but from the context of those times, I do think that we could say that it was a real step forward and a real beacon of progress in an industry that was, ridiculously backwards and often racist in terms of their employment practices.
So that actually leads me to a question I'm super curious about, and that is about #MeToo. I think that Me Too, it's really about storytelling, right? It's about hearing voices that we haven't heard before and stories that we haven't heard before. And hopefully it's about changing attitudes in industry. Peggy, can you tell us how this has been affecting people in your industry or in your company? And what is it like when we're talking about these tensions that are, in this case, workplace tensions, when you are a female in leadership?
Yeah, so I've been 30 years in this industry, and people ask me all the time, well, you must have stories. And, there's probably not a woman out there who doesn't have some story of an inappropriate comment somewhere along the line. But I like to tell sort of a positive story on this topic. I was talking to my daughter the other day, who's in the tech industry. She's 27 years old. And we were talking about the whole Me Too thing. And she said, Mom, I don't laugh at inappropriate jokes at work. And my first reaction was, wow, I always laughed. Like, I thought I had to. I always laughed. I don't know if I'd be here today if I didn't. And she said, why are you surprised? And I said, where did you learn that from? And she's like, Mom, I learned it from you. And then the second aha moment was, she learned it, from my 50-year-old self, not my 25-year-old self. My 25-year-old self laughed. And so things are changing. She doesn't laugh. And she said, and none of my friends laugh either. And we'll call it out. Something's inappropriate. I never did. I just thought, I'm not going to say anything. I'm not going to rock the boat. And so things are changing. We've got a lot of stories. We can go on for days on those stories, but that's the story I like to tell, that things are changing. I see it in my own workplace at Microsoft. We're working very hard on being inclusive, making sure all voices are heard, making sure everybody's aware of what's inappropriate, and shining a light on things and not shirking from that. And that's made all the difference in the world.
Margot, do you think if your ladies had the internet or Twitter, things would have been different?
Maybe. I mean, it's interesting because this topic did come up with these ladies who were working in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s, the Mad Men era, and there were a lot of things that happened to them that they said, we didn't realize, they didn't have an option. There wasn't somebody saying, this is inappropriate. It was part of an era of women who wanted to move ahead, who had the awareness that what they did affected the women who came behind them, and what they were doing was, they were responsible to the next generation of women who wanted to do what they were doing, and who really, who sacrificed, who, turned their heads, who did a lot of things that we don't have to do today. because they endured a work environment that was less forgiving and less open and more hostile than the one that we have today. So, that's something that I'm really aware of. Talking to those women is that, the silence that they often had to keep all of those years, they did that, and we don't have to, because they stayed. It was their way of staying in the workplace and moving ahead.
And just to add on to that, not only the silence, but the cycles you had to spend to do, first you're doing your job, and then you have to remember, okay, don't go down that hallway because you know who sits down there. There was that whisper network, that you went out of your way to avoid certain people or certain customers. After dinner, it was like, I'm out of here because I know what the next question is going to be. So those things, think of all that productivity time that went to those wasted cycles because of that dynamic that was going on. And I think of so many women along the way who dropped out of engineering. They just said, I'm done with this. And I think of the ladies in your book who had to go to another building to use the bathroom. And finally, an ally spoke up for them.
And the mental, we all in a workplace, we all have these moments where there's difficult colleague, there are all these things, we all know what they are, and the mental space and energy it takes to withstand that. And so, when you think about the stories of these women in the years past and doing that year after, day after day and year after year, and still giving their best, right? And doing superb work and mentoring women who came behind them. I mean, they're just superb role models.
Absolutely. That's what we need, more role models. That's why we have to get more in the funnel.
We need to get more in the funnel.
Keep going.
Yeah.
I know we want to leave time for questions, but I don't want to leave here without talking about AI, artificial intelligence, and machine learning. And for those of you who are not experts in AI, we've all had exposure to it in the movies, at least. If you've ever seen an Iron Man movie or Ex Machina or some movie like that. But I want to talk about where it comes from, where the information and the inputs from AI come from, and whom does AI serve, artificial intelligence serve. And I wonder, Peggy, if you can start us off by helping us understand how women and AI intersect. And given that the vast majority of artificial intelligence is built by people who aren't women and aren't women of color, talk about built-in biases or what the effect can be. And you're not off the hook, Margot, even though you might not be an AI person.
So basically, you can think of AI as a tool to augment human intelligence. And it's really just a tool. And I think you do hear a lot of both ends of the spectrum. Some people think it's magic fairy dust and it's going to make my business grow when I sprinkle some AI on it. But then the other end, it's a doomsday device and we have to contain it and don't let it out of the Pandora's box. And it's somewhere in between, right? It's a tool, like any tool, it can be used for good, it can be used to damage. But I think the thing we have to be very careful with as we start to engage with artificial intelligence is artificial intelligence is run, it's fueled by data. And so as you bring data into these AI algorithms, you need to ensure that the data has biases pulled out of it. And an example I like to use is if I'm a company, I'm a startup, and I'm looking for the 20 best engineers out there, and I said, okay, give me a bunch of resumes of, go back 20 years. Tell me who are the best engineers who have, risen in their field. Those resumes would be largely male because we know the stats. So the algorithm may conclude that the best engineers are male. And so that's just one example of how a bias can get in the way of an outcome. And as we start to deploy AI for things like who gets bank loans, who gets educated, we have to think about that outcome. If that could change the trajectory of someone's life because the algorithm was wrong. So you need to ensure that AI the data coming in is as clean as possible and the biases are taken out. But you also need to ensure that women are on those design teams. So the algorithms themselves, as they're designed, you need to make sure you have all voices in there. If you're building an algorithm for, say, bank loans, and your intention is to give bank loans to the broadest sector of the population, you want to have all sorts of voices and diversity of thought on those teams and make sure it's just not one type, because you'll make the perfect algorithm for that one type and maybe not be able to include everybody in the bank loan process.
So interesting. And on the other side, Margot, you, so when the big computers came, the ones you plug in the wall, not the women, came to NASA, that was both, to me, an opportunity, but it was also a threat to jobs. And could you talk a little bit about that and how the women perceive that? And if you could share some stories perhaps about Dorothy Vaughan particularly, that would be really interesting.
Yeah, so for those of you who aren't familiar with the story, Dorothy Vaughan was the African-American woman. She was the head of the segregated West Area Computing Group. So she was a black woman supervising a group of black female computers. They were mathematicians. And as the 40s turned into the 50s to the 60s, and NASA and business and everyone around the country became more reliant on computing power to to do everything from spaceflight to business calculations, the women had to learn how to program. And there were some women in NASA in general who chose to, instead of learning to, use punch cards and Fortran and BASIC and all of these other things, stayed with the old-fashioned desktop calculating machines, which were state-of-the-art in 1935, but by 1955, 1960, this was the trailing edge. Dorothy Vaughan really pushed her girls, as they were known at the time, as they called each other, she really pushed her girls to take programming, to be as competitive as possible. And what she told them is, and it's a really interesting intersection of both race and gender and technologies. She said integration is coming, meaning that there's going to be this entirely different world where everyone competes against everyone else. And in fact, what happened in 1958 is they consolidated this group. There were men, there were women, there were black women, there were white women. Everybody was basically there in this consolidated computing group. And Dorothy Vaughan really pushed the women, because she knew that if they had those tools, if they were ahead of that breach, between the past and the future and the past, then they would have a chance to keep their jobs to remain competitive. I think it's a really interesting story of someone being very aware of the double-edged sword of progress, because of course what happened to Dorothy Vaughan is once that West Area Computing Group was integrated, she was a supervisor then, but she was no longer a supervisor in the integrated group. So she really had the vision to know that even then that she felt her role would be, her future, her legacy would be carried out in the women who came behind her.
Peggy, you alluded to a pipeline in what you just said, and I wonder if there's this kind of championing of women by other women, or that kind of, real leadership is what you're describing on Dorothy's part, and
Absolute
vision.
leadership, total leadership.
Today.
Oh, no, absolutely there is, and I think we still don't have the numbers coming in. We know young women. There's some biases in our culture now that tend to steer them away from math as early as 4th grade. A lot of times, you'll hear people say, oh, my daughter, she loves math and science. And then they get into middle school and they start to think they're not good in math. And some of that is just this cultural bias. They think boys are good in math and girls aren't. And it's simply not true, but that's the first thing. You have to change that whole attitude and make sure that they feel that they can succeed. And there's such better tools now for that. There's things like, I know Sal Khan's here from Khan Academy. If you don't quite grasp something in your class, now you can go home and look at it online and go over and over it. We didn't have those kind of tools then, when I was coming up through school. So we have a lot better tools. That's good. We have to keep them on that path. But when they do get to university, there could be a little bit of an intimidation effect when you walk into a classroom and you've got young boys in there who've been coding since 4th grade. They've been taking coding camps, and that's all fantastic and good, but maybe they didn't choose to, or they didn't know that they could, or they didn't have access to them. And then there's just already a bias. I'm not as good as them because they're really good. they know what they're doing, and so I must not be good in this. So there's another bias in there that we're working on. And Maria Clave, who's the president of Harvey Mudd College in California, does such a good job with this. She recognized that, and she made sure that the young women who were in these classrooms had an ally, had someone else in there who they could at least kind of, they could talk to and say, you don't understand this either? Either do I. Kind of pair people up so that they didn't have this high dropout rate. And so it's about digging in a little bit more on all the various inflection points. And then when they get into corporates, ensuring that they see the path to leadership and they see a path to manager and vice president and senior vice president, because those numbers get smaller as we go up. And so we're working hard to, as we look at the different levels going up through the chain, that we ensure that we're being inclusive about how we're looking at people. And it's really just about shining a light on it. I feel like once you're aware, then you realize as you start to make those choices, oh, I need to think about these things. And so that's been a big part of the change at Microsoft. We've really shown a light on that and in making sure that we're being inclusive in all of our decisions.
Thank you. I want to go to questions. Did you want to say something? You look like you had something to say. So let's go to questions. There is a microphone in the back and over there. So if you raise your hand, one of these nice people will come to you. And there's one right there.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you guys for taking the time. My question is on creating allies. What recommendations do you have for individuals or in the workplace, tangible steps they can take to create allies without compromising their own identity?
Right. So we think a lot about that at Microsoft. And one of the things, we have a lot of employee groups. And so we have something called Blacks at Microsoft. I think it's been there 30 years. It's a great group. And one of the things that we're focused on is it doesn't have to just be for Blacks. We want to make sure everybody understands sort of the journeys that our Black employees are on. And so we've really really tried to change up that dynamic and ensuring that everybody's invited to the events that group puts on, so that you have an understanding of what it's like to walk in someone else's shoes. And I'll just give you one example of this. We had a dinner with senior leadership, Blacks at Microsoft group. And we were talking to them. It was during the Black Lives Matter time. And we had not asked enough questions of our own employees. We thought, well, they're fine. There's no issue here. And they said, no, we have concerns. When I drop my kids off at school, I have concerns. And that was very eye-opening for us. We then said we should have been asking questions. We should have been asking more. We should have been leaning in more on their journeys. And that's really changed a lot. So I would say an ally is someone who maybe isn't part of that group, but is a listener and a learner and trying to understand the path that you're on and to help you along that path. And I would just point to that ally of mine back when I almost dropped out of engineering, who took the time to listen and learn the journey I was on. I was struggling, and he hadn't seen that. Shine a light on it, you can change it.
Yeah, and I would say a true ally is somebody who doesn't cause you to compromise your identity. And at the same time, I think we have to be really open to different facets of our identity. I mean, the one of the most wonderful stories in Hidden Figures in my research was this, not just a partnership or a mentorship, but a true friendship that developed between Mary Jackson and an engineer named Kazimir Sarnicki, who supported her when she had to petition the city of Hampton, which was then segregated, to go to the night classes because she was a Black woman going to a segregated school, who pushed her into the engineering training class. They worked together for more than 2 decades. They published any number of papers together. She organized his retirement party. They clicked. There were many aspects of their identities that were different. They really bonded on this identity of being an engineer. And, Kazimir saw that in her, and he really made it his business, his responsibility. He made her career his responsibility. And that made all the difference. So, I think that identities are very complex, but I think that a true ally is somebody who sees all of that complexity and that allows you to see their complexity, that you form a bond across those different things.
I just want to add to that on a more personal note about an ally being somebody who's supportive and who listens and who makes space for whoever you are. And that is that Margot noted just before the panel started that for all three of us, our husbands came to the panel. So
Yes.
there's something.
Thank you, husband.
I saw other hands. There's a hand here.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. You guys are such an inspiration, and maybe it's just an observation, but if I could just share the quickest story. My parents really valued education and supported me, and I ended up with a PhD in hydrology. And then when we built our family, we adopted a couple of daughters from Cambodia, and I'm a math mom. I love math, and so my girls grew up loving math, and one of my daughters just graduated high school a month ago, and she was in College Calc 3, and she looked at all the top women's colleges, and she's going to Smith because they have a Bachelor of Science in Engineering. And it makes me wonder that I think parents and your love of math and science in your household, or your fear of math and science in your household, I think can have such a dramatic impact on your young women in particular, maybe even more so than the teachers you encounter, because if you have parents that fear math or say, I'm not a math parent, because I hear that all the time, and I'm like, but you're imprinting on your kids. And so I don't know if you thoughts around that or the influence of that.
So I think the question is, are we complicit?
My dad tried to make me into an engineer or scientist. He didn't quite succeed. But I definitely, grew up taking a lot of the calculus and engineering and, computers and whatever. And it was a big influence. And I would love to see the statistics on NASA parents, and not just NASA dads, but NASA moms, like the ones who, I wrote about, and NASA kids, not just daughters, but sons, who then went on to technical careers. I think there's a very high correlation between having a technical parent and having kids who were nudged in that direction as well.
Yeah. So for me, the other part of my 15 kids is, it was actually 8 kids, and my father passed away when I was very young. I was second youngest. I had a little sister who was 9 months old, and I was 2, and then 6 kids above me. And my mom was lucky enough to find a second life partner who his wife had passed away, and they had 7 kids. So we all moved into a big house. But that actually wasn't that big, looking back now. But it was so much fun, and they were just all about education. Like my dad ran a gas station in Los Angeles, so he didn't have a technical background. He had a mechanical background, I guess. But it was all about education. And I remember my mom saying, you could be me. You could have 8 kids and have lost your husband. So make sure whatever you do, you get a degree and you're able to support yourself. So that was the driving force in my life. And so it was maybe less about getting a technical degree. As I said, I didn't know what an engineer was, but I knew I had to get a degree. That was the bottom line.
Interesting. I saw more hands. Okay.
Hi, my name is Huang. I'm from the Basel Scholars Program. And my question for all 3 of you is, how can men cooperate to create a safe and a collaborative workplace for women in a male-dominated field?
You should answer. You can answer any
Look
questions.
at me, huh? So that's a great question. Thank you for asking. And just very briefly, and then you can hear from these very smart women. We are talking about social norms and changing social norms, right? We are in a society that has been evolving and maybe not looking at revolutionary change for our social norms. But I think that if you, particularly young people, have a future that you envision, and it is a future of inclusion and parity and equity and a place where it doesn't matter where you come from or, again, your socioeconomic background, I think that by harnessing that vision and putting all of your power and your interest and your mind and your heart toward that, I think that is what's going to make the change.
I really think there's a lot to be said for empathy and putting yourself in someone else's shoes. I mean, every one of us has felt, that a boss has been unfair, that, that colleagues maybe weren't as supportive, that you were treated as if you were, not intelligent when maybe you just didn't understand, they didn't explain. There are all these things that we all feel. And we know those emotions. So it's not that hard to say, oh, I can imagine someone else feels that. And then maybe to say, oh, they felt that in the context of this gender situation or this racial situation. But we all know those emotions. We all feel insecure at work, and we all are ambitious at work. So I really think there's a lot to stopping, and instead of saying, well, I can't connect with that person because they're so different from me, to remember the ways that these emotions, we all have these emotions, and to maybe start to see how the structures trigger the emotions in other people or cause the situations, and that maybe it's not so different from the kinds of emotions that you feel.
And I would say one very concrete thing that I tell my fellow male employees, to use a very sports analogy, throw women the ball. Because a lot of times when I'm in a meeting, even still today, I'll be in a meeting and it's hard for me to break in, to sort of grab the floor, because there's a lot of, louder voices going on. And I have something to say, and I don't know if it's the way I was raised. I always think, well, I've got to wait till there's an opening. But if there's a man in the room and he sees that happening, just turn to her and say, did you have something to add? And that's such an entree, and it's so helpful. And it allows, it could be a quiet man as well. It just allows those voices to be heard that might not in that kind of an environment. So throw them the ball.
So do we have time for 2 more questions? Okay, in 4 minutes, I saw a hand over here. It was not yours, but go ahead. And then over there in the back. Go ahead.
My name is Kayo Jolisa. I'm from Cameroon. I'm a business scholar. I want to thank you for sharing your experience in the field of engineering and leadership. I believe one of the reasons why women don't engage in engineering is because they believe that they won't be able to cope being a mother and being an engineer. So I would love you to share your experiences, maybe challenges that you encountered being a mother and being an engineer, and how did you overcome these challenges?
As the engineers table.
And a mother 3 times over. I can say it got easier. When I first had our first child, it was hard. Both my husband and I were working and juggling a lot. He's right here. He's super supportive of me. Wave to everyone there. And I remember I was under such pressure. We didn't have much money, and I thought, I've got to get right back to work. And I went back at 5 weeks, and it was super hard. It was super hard. And then the middle one, I think it was 8 weeks. And then by the time the third one came around, I'm like, that's it. I'm taking 6 months off, because I just need to, take a deep breath and have this child. Women have babies, and they need time afterwards. And women need different amounts of time. But that third baby, I wanted to take 6 months off, and I did. And I was lucky enough to have a supportive company at the time that allowed me to do that, at Qualcomm at the time. And now at Microsoft, we have 20 weeks paid for post-birth. And it's just been unbelievably well received, as you might imagine, because it can be a little bit difficult to balance everything. And that in and of itself is going to be a real game changer.
Yeah, I'm not a mother, but I can tell you the women that I wrote about, all of them were. And they really, it was very important to them to find a way to support their roles as working mothers. I mean, they really did work to support their families. And professionals who really took their job seriously. They found a way to do that. It wasn't always easy, and there were times when they really had to sacrifice for their children. But I think this idea that that we have to have the balance will benefit not just women as mothers, but women of all backgrounds, men as fathers as well. I think that's probably something that doesn't get talked about a lot, but I think there's perhaps the real beneficiary might be men and fathers who all of a sudden are allowed to have more of their identity and feel less that they, all they have to do is just go to work, and if anything personal comes up, then that's it. So it seems like maybe a larger humanizing influence, hopefully, in the workforce.
And paternity leave.
And paternity
Which is
leave.
super important and as critical, so. Good thing to have.
And I want to say that when we talk about balance, you think that it's real balance, that both things are equal and they always are like this. But I'm going to say that that's not really true. I think when we talk about work-life balance, we talk about feeling good about being able to do both things, even though one thing, it might be like this and it might be like this, but it works for the individual person and the individual family. Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely.
to say?
And the individual person over different times of their life.
Yeah.
That's right. And somebody back there needs a microphone. That guy.
I'm actually going to concede my question to whoever was over here because the two young students, scholars, asked my questions.
Okay?
So-
Oh, nice.
Who else would like one last question? Sir.
On the issue of parental leave, male or female, the difference between being in a project job where you can be replaced versus a managerial job where management has to be ongoing, how are you handling that?
Well, we have parental leave, whether you're in a project or a manager. So
When a manager leaves, how is that responsibility taken over, and is that job available when the person comes back?
their job is always available or an equivalent job when they come back. But we actually have used it as an opportunity to put people into a role. Maybe they're not manager yet, but we might try them out in a managerial role. So we use these short-term leaves, whether they're for someone is off taking care of a sick parent, or they've just had a child, or they just adopted a child, as sort of moments of opportunity for others in the staff to step into that. So we manage through that. Sometimes it's a little challenging, but we do manage through that.
Okay, well, thank you, Margot Lee Shetterly and Peggy Johnson.